So you killed Fuzzy Wuzzy in what, West Twin or East Twin?
East Twin.
East Twin, which was a clover plot at that time.
Yeah, with a corn pile in the middle of it.
Well, that tends to enhance the attractiveness.
Yeah.
Episode 25 of the HUNTR podcast.
We can confirm. That's right.
Almost half a year.
Attaboy. Yes, it is.
Well, we've been double dutying a few.
Oh yeah, that's right. Duty.
Almost half a year. Almost half a year.
Yeah, dude, are we on a 3-week binge of doubles?
I think so.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, team's probably getting annoyed with me being
These guys?
inaccessible. Not those guys.
You guys getting annoyed?
No, they don't have a choice. That's their job.
No, we're fine.
Yeah,
We're fine.
so, but I mean, we're kind of like at that time of year where I feel like doubles are necessary. Like July, right there.
Yeah, man.
Next week.
We're coming into it.
This week, if you're
I've been
listening.
saying, I say that every podcast, I'm pretty sure. But yeah, there's stuff on the horizon for sure. So probably right in front of us, we've got a little day planned up to the Ohio lease.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
On the 5th of July. It's like 2 weeks. Does that disappoint you, Ian?
Yeah, Debbie Downer. Oh, we've got a lease day planned.
Keep your hands off the sound machine, Ian.
Jeez.
So yeah, I think we're gonna head up there and yeah. So I was trying to explain to Ian like the work that needs done essentially is we've got to spray fall plots is probably the main objective. We'd also like to get some cameras out. So
yeah,
Stealth is coming with new cameras, but maybe not quite in time for this trip. So
I'm on top of it. I mean, good chance that we will have them. I don't know about for that trip or not.
Yeah.
So they're either going to be on the way or we'll have them by then.
Oh, that's fine. So we've
if
got
not, we'll use the old fusions
from last year that will work solidly for now.
How many cameras do you think we need? We got 400 acres of hardwoods there.
It's more a question of how much time are we going to have that
Got
day,
it.
because there's a lot of work to be done. That's where I'm torn. I might even go up on Sunday the 4th and try to get all of my stuff done at the farm. That's what I told Colton. I was like, dude, I'll just tell you what work what needs done, and you tell me from a family and planning perspective.
Got to spray and
not family planning, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
if he wants to come or not,
it's his choice.
Yeah, and so I may go Sunday and spray at my place and throw. I mean, I'd love to get 5 to 7 cameras out at my place, I suppose, just on mineral. And then over at the lease, so we don't need to actually do the spraying over there. Bob's got a sprayer; it's good to go. He does need some help getting. And this is the landowner who we're dealing with.
Our base camp leasing landowner.
He needs some help getting a disc unstuck. It's in a field somewhere. So
got it stuck. I need it unstuck.
So we'll help him with that. And sounds like he had a pacemaker put in recently. So
yeah, we probably don't want him to die on us.
He's in kind of rough shape. So yeah, we got to keep him alive so we can.
It's interesting.
Keep the
I
lease.
think a lot of people would think like when you go through a program like base camp leasing that you don't end up like ever even talking or engaging with the landowner. That's completely far from the case. In fact, I think almost every landowner we're leasing from, we've engaged with to say like, hey, what do you need from us? We're here to help. Like, here's our information.
Yeah.
And I assume they want to know who's on their property.
Yeah, the lease is one thing, but a personal relationship with the landowner is
100%.
We're
going to get him some deer grow, get him some hunter swag, maybe some deer grow stuff if the new shirts come in.
He'd like for us to bring some seed as well. He said if we could do that,
get some seed.
He'd be appreciative.
I'll bring my seed.
So he's good on Gly. He's good with a sprayer. He needs some help getting the disc unstuck, and he would like some seed and some deer grow from us.
Okay. Yeah, we may not have seed for the 5th, but we'll get it, right?
Yeah. Well, I suppose he doesn't need it till about 2 weeks after, 2-3 weeks after.
We're going to just plant it end of July. Okay.
That'd be the plan. So
cool.
So I don't know as far as getting cameras out on that place. He's got just like he dropped some salt blocks kind of around. I don't know exactly where.
I mean, that's all I would do. We're gonna we got Bronson back today.
Yep.
Dr. Bronson Strickland from Mississippi State Deer Lab making his second appearance. I think we picked his brain a little bit last time, but looking forward to doing it again.
Yeah.
But we're gonna talk about mineral usage and you know, it'd be interesting. We have gotten some rain here recently, but like we were dry for a while there. And so I wonder, you know, a lot of times these deer are hitting these mineral blocks because the water content, they're essentially peeing out salt. And so they're needing salt to then replace that in their body. That's the attraction there.
Yeah.
And so you would think that when it's drought and the water content in plants and stuff is lower, they don't need to hit those mineral blocks as much.
Bronson will probably tell me I'm dead wrong, but my observation has been, at least on my farm, that if it's not raining, those deer are not hitting the minerals as much.
I would think that would be my observation too.
Yeah. But
we'll see what he has to say about that.
Yeah.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah. I got my beans in, almost 2 weeks ago now at this point. And, you know, Dad said they had popped like 3-4 days after we planted them. So it was good soil moisture, and I got a good rain the other day. Actually blew over we have a swing set at this house that we bought. Blew it over.
I saw that. You sent me a picture of that.
Oh, we had a raging bonfire last night.
Yeah?
Yeah, burnt the whole thing.
Was that on your property?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I thought it was like your neighbor's house.
Mm-mm.
It was your swing set.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's disappointing. Where are you going to swing now?
We got a porch swing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we got a porch swing. I got more swings than I can swing on. Yeah, swings everywhere.
Got swings everywhere.
Yeah.
Swings everywhere.
Yeah, so I tore that down and got her burnt up. I bought Margie, this is how I guess I'm younger than you still, but this is how you know you're getting old. She wanted a leaf blower for her birthday.
Nice.
Which is coming up, so I went to Lowe's, and you know, that it's pretty applicable for our business, so I put it on the card, and I got her like the best leaf blower. It's an electronic.
Oh yeah.
Like a battery power, like
lithium battery.
Probably they make. I would assume a gas powered one is probably stronger, but dude, this thing is insane.
Like the steel ones are pretty good.
I blew it at her in the house.
You blew her away.
I literally I thought I was gonna hurt her just with the
She's like rolling on the floor. You're like, isn't this awesome?
The force of the air. Yeah.
I'll tell you what, it is nice to have though when you start to do some prescribed burns.
Yeah.
To have that battery one or a gas one.
Oh, trust me. I'm all in the back of my mind. Any purchase that I make, I'm like, I could use this for. I'm like, sweetheart, we really need this. This tree pruner for like our shrubs around the house.
Yeah, for those mulberry bushes.
Right.
They're getting out of control.
Yeah. Meanwhile, I've got it packed for Illinois. So.
Well, why don't we bring in our guest?
Let's get him on.
Get him cranking.
Yeah.
There he is.
Welcome. Can you hear us, Bronson?
I sure can.
How are you, sir?
I'm doing wonderful.
Good morning.
Y'all? Good morning.
Good. It's good to see you again.
This
meeting is being recorded.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Is it being recorded
in
again?
case you weren't aware.
The Russians are recording your meeting. Wearing your Mississippi State pride for the Bulldogs in Omaha, huh?
Yeah, that's exactly right. As of right now, today, we are still in it. I don't know when this will be dropped publicly. Hopefully by then we'll still be in it. But right now, we still have high hopes.
If we're still in it,
what sport is this?
Baseball, NCAA baseball. If we're still in it, yeah, you don't know. You're like, is that a touchdown? No. If we're still in it when this drops, we're probably in pretty good shape.
We're going to be in real good shape.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So
yeah,
we're playing.
That's encouraging.
In the College World Series.
Good. College World Series
in Omaha, Nebraska.
Okay,
it's a big deal.
Probably heard of it.
It's baseball.
That's like the Little League World Series.
Oh,
but
like
older.
Like Omaha, the Steaks Company. Yeah.
Yeah, baseball.
Baseball.
Knuckleballs. Yeah.
So Bronson, what do you got going on down south? It's hot down there, huh?
It's hot. And it really started about a week ago. We have officially settled in for the next 3 months of high temperatures, high humidities. So everyone's bracing themselves. It's kind of like up north when y'all deal with those horrific winters and I don't know how you do it. For 3 months, 4 months, it seems like. Yeah, we've got July, August, and September ahead of us. And luckily we have air conditioning.
Yeah, that's good.
We got to think about the deer. They don't. And, that can have some impacts as well on them, body growth, maybe a little bit of antler size and so forth.
Now, did you guys, was it this past weekend you got like that tropical depression that came up through there?
We sure did. So we very lucky from some respects where we're at. We got a lot of rainfall, but we didn't get enough to cause flooding like in other places.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point in time, we're really good on soil moisture.
Yep.
So that's good.
Well, and
I
that's
think
where
we are too.
Yeah, well, I think we are now.
We did get some flooding though.
Yeah.
In fact, my wife got caught in like there's this road down in Pittsburgh that floods pretty quickly just because of the way that the river goes back. It's a creek.
Mm-hmm.
And she's got this brand new Toyota Highlander that I got her for our anniversary or something, and the whole bottom of it got ripped off because the flood water. She's like driving through the flood water and ripped the protective plate off the bottom, but our soil moisture looks great. So
Yeah.
yeah, and actually I got a bunch of soybeans in since we spoke last. Colton and I went up and planted, along with my dad, planted about 6.5 acres, and I think they germinated like that night.
Yeah.
Like the
It was
night
like
that I got them
perfect
in.
timing.
And then I bet they look great right now. I haven't been back since,
Cranking.
but they're probably a couple inches at this point.
So I guess, Bronson, kind of looking at that, obviously there's parts of the country where you guys are, where we're at, that have had rain. We talked with Chris Duncan in Iowa last week, and the Midwest is like, they did get some rain, but I mean, they're still in like epic drought proportions at this point. You know, I kind of want to maybe take this podcast in two different paths. Let's start with the one that we talked with Chris a bunch about. In kind of my experience, and even when I was down at Mississippi State in the deer pens, it seemed like if we had a wet, like late spring, early summer, and then typically what happens is it seems like the faucet turns off, right, and it gets dry in August, September, we see larger outbreaks of EHD. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, to some extent. I don't think you can say it's a general rule because there's so many dynamics that go on with that, the particular type of virus or variant of the virus and so forth. So there's a lot of different dynamics there, but I think there's some merit to that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I guess we were just kind of looking at it from a standpoint of, standing water, creation of mud flats and that kind of thing. And it is probably property specific and region specific, but it just seems like if we kind of go back to some of those, 2012, 15, 18 or 19, like they kind of seem like they've happened in that sequential order. Whereas, if we were drought, like in the late spring, early summer, and then we got rain, like it didn't seem like we had that much of an issue. But I know that's in unlike where we're at and in Iowa, EHD is pretty much an every year occurrence down there, or HD, and hemorrhagic disease.
Yeah, it's typically not as big of a deal for us just because deer are adapted to that. They're confronted with that virus almost every year to some extent. And so just over, decades and decades and decades, deer adapt to it. The deer that don't adapt to it, they die. and those that do live. So it's, an obvious evolutionary process there. But when the virus becomes novel, or maybe not a novel virus entirely, but a variant of it or a strain of it, and then especially when it reaches the Midwest or up north, that's when you see these devastating and accurate stories of we think we lost half our deer or 2/3 of our deer herd. That's completely believable. Yeah.
I think when you start to, and a lot of guys have a tough time comprehending that, and the fact that there are, like, you can have that almost every year in and out in the South, and yet we see it in a wave in the Midwest and North, and it just wipes out half the deer herd. And I mean, living in Mississippi, I've seen, many of those deer make it through. We obviously see certain signs, like we look for hoof deformities, right? To have some indication that the deer likely, so you've got a hoof deformity. Some indication that deer had likely experienced some sort of hemorrhagic disease. We look for other symptoms during the, like, swollen jaw, things like that. But it's so crazy to think that the deer of same species in the South can over time become, resistant to it. And literally any deer in the Midwest and Northeast that gets it is pretty much dead. It's a death sentence.
Yeah, I wouldn't say most every deer, but certainly a significant amount of them. And, their body is just confronted with something new. Their immune system is confronted with something they've never battled before. And my goodness, aren't we living in a time now where that's true with COVID? It's at a much larger scale. We see some of the death rates that are attributed to COVID, but in some of these populations, again, mostly the Midwest, northern populations, it can literally be half of the deer. And if we want to look at some of the legacy of that, Jeremy, just think about, I think we've talked about this before, but the history of restocking in the Southeast. And so those deer get off the rail car and they may live for a year or two. But now, and we're doing this more and more, as we're doing these genetic analyses and we're seeing what genes were perpetuated and prospered in the Southeast, it's mainly the southern deer.
Sure.
There's very, very little evidence that those Wisconsin genes, for example, were able to make it over time.
So, I mean, you say maybe not every deer that obviously gets infected in the Midwest and Northeast. Do you think, I guess two things. Number one, it seems like we didn't even talk about this until 2011 or 12 in the Midwest and Northeast. I don't remember anybody really talking about it. So I guess what do you think has started to, lead into this actually happening now in the Midwest and Northeast? And then I guess a second.
When you say Northeast too, is it primarily Wisconsin? Because it doesn't seem like we've experienced a serious outbreak around here.
Pennsylvania has, Southwest Pennsylvania has
it?
For sure, and Ohio and West Virginia and Maryland, but northern Pennsylvania and New York, no, not so much. I would say southern Ohio, southwest Pennsylvania. Is it to the
level of severity that Iowa and those places have? Really?
Yeah, so Washington and Greene County, which is just west of us, had, total herd
and it seems
losses.
Just pretty isolated then, because I knock on wood, at my farm, it's like I said, over the past 6 years, I've found maybe two deer.
It does seem, I guess that's where I'm going with this, Bronson. It seems like there's I wouldn't say that it's necessarily like a latitudinal line, but it is definitely something like that, to where Iowa through southern Illinois, southern Indiana, southern Ohio, southern Pennsylvania, and south was where it just got hammered.
Yeah. And that could, now keep in mind, I am not a disease expert. You really need to talk to someone that specializes in disease. But here's my best guess. Let's think about the vector of the disease as well, which is a gnat or a midge of the genus Culicoides. And it could be that you reach some latitudinal barrier when you get to northern Pennsylvania or New York or et cetera, to where just that midge or that gnat isn't going to live long enough, for the disease process to manifest. And so maybe there were some instances where the disease was passed on to deer, but then you had cold weather, you had your first frost, which is going to kill all of those gnats. And so maybe it terminated the process a lot quicker than maybe further down south.
We talked about that with Chris. One of the things, and I've kind of paid, when I lived in Missouri, obviously I experienced it for the first time in 2008 when we were working in the MSU Deer Lab facility. And then in a wild setting, let's just say, I was part of the 2011 and 12 major outbreaks in the Midwest and Missouri and in Iowa. And so I kind of started to follow it more. It definitely seems, and again, observationally, right, I'm not a disease expert, but it definitely seems like maybe the jet stream to a point has an effect on it, where Iowa, we talked about this with Chris last week, Iowa, even into the Dakotas, tends to have those warmer weather trends that go into mid-September even, whereas, and that dips through the southwest corner of Pennsylvania, south of your farm, in fact.
Yeah.
And so it seems like maybe that warmer weather, that first frost doesn't happen until later there, where in the northern tier of Pennsylvania, Labor Day weekend, you could get a frost.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. And when you think about, and I'm digging deep here, that's
the whole point of this podcast, Bronson, is we're digging.
Well, yeah, but it becomes problematic when you're remembering something when you dig deep. But I think what was unique about that, 7 or 8 years ago when we really saw that severe outbreak, was that it was a variant that I believe, variant of the virus that is, that evolved in the Caribbean.
Hmm.
A particular weather event, which you jogged my memory there talking about the jet stream, kind of moved those culicoides, those gnats, into the southeast, and then they kind of moved upwards. So again, an unqualified answer is
Sure.
I think there's potentially merit to that, but none of us know for sure.
And when you say variant, not to dig down the virus rabbit hole, but are you talking like, I know when we were in Mississippi State doing research, there was so let me back up. A lot of people will say hemorrhagic disease, right, versus epizootic hemorrhagic disease. A lot of people will just say blue tongue, but there truly is an EHD virus and a blue tongue virus that are completely separate. In fact, there's like a blue tongue 1 and 2 or something like that.
Yeah, like blue tongue V1,
yes,
2, etc.
So
I think they're all within the same family of hemorrhagic disease viruses. They're just tweaked a little bit differently, and they affect the animal's immune system a little bit differently in how they attack it and handle it.
So when you say that variant and stuff, are you talking about like a Midge variant, or are you talking about like one of those virus variants?
One of the virus variants.
Gotcha.
Like we're dealing now with COVID with the new Delta,
the
British version and the South African. It's just, the virus also evolves as well. And those that live and get new hosts, they become more common in the population. And it's kind of the exact same process.
Interesting. Out of our control at the end of the day. Can't do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, all you could do is just pray it doesn't affect your farm.
Yeah, all you can do is cross your fingers and hope it doesn't come to your farm.
Just hope. Well, I suppose the reason I came up is we're talking about just trends with precipitation, specifically looking at this year. And I think my statement was, I don't think that, at least in the Midwest and the Northeast, and probably the Southeast, that lack of rain like early in the season, like April, May, June, really affects a deer herd. And my hope here is that you'll confirm or tell me I'm wrong, because I really don't know. It doesn't really affect the herd as much as some people claim, like especially in terms of antler size. I know people is a big one, but also in way of diseases like EHD. It does really seem like from that maybe July, but especially August, and even more so September is when we lack rain in those periods. The herds really are at risk for things like that.
Yeah. So why don't we compare it to what goes on each year in Southwest Texas? I think that makes a good comparison. So in that environment, you may have very little rainfall in the wintertime. And then when you have a dry spring, so number one, you have no soil moisture or very little. Then you don't follow it up with any spring rainfall. Therefore, you have no forbs that are grown. Yep. And you will essentially, and this, is jaw dropping when you think about it, unless you're, have experience with those deer herds, you may have no fawn crop that year. I mean, they'll be born, but they don't live. And so it's very common to have fawn crops less than 10%.
Yep.
Wow.
All. And it's all because of nutrition and cover and not having any vegetation. So now let's contrast that
also,
with
they got
Southeast.
freaking like jaguars in Texas.
Maybe a jaguarundi every once in a while. But
there you
go. Yeah, maybe in West Texas a jaguar every once in a while. Compare that with the Southeast. You're always going to have, number one, a wet winter. And in most of the East, you're going to have a wet winter. So you're going to have a buildup of soil moisture. Now, why is that important? You're always going to have spring green up.
Yeah.
That's not going to be the case in a semi-arid environment like someplace in Texas. So we're always going to have a spring green up. And Jared, just like you mentioned, that's really hardly ever, never say never, but rarely is that going to be a big deal, east of Texas.
Yeah.
What's going to be more important for us is going to be, are we going to accelerate the rate of plant maturation, or we would say senescence, but basically plant death, meaning they have Their life cycle is over. They've gone to seed. They're more fibrous, more lignin content, meaning nutrient quality is very low. Are we going to accelerate that by having very little rainfall, say midsummer on? And about every 5 years or so, we certainly see that in the Southeast. And I'm sure you see it in your neck of the woods as well. And so what we did, so it's never devastating for us, just like, believe it or not, in South Texas, it's never devastating, these droughts, to the adult deer.
Yep.
They can browse on existing mature trees, cactus, etc. Adults can keep living. What suffers is that you have no fawns and you have below average antlers. We see that to a much smaller extent, but we still see it somewhat, even in the Southeast. So, Jeremy, you're familiar with our DMAP database. Yep. So we've got about 30 years now of harvest data. And when we go back and link that up, we see that on the years where we have these really hot, dry, late summer, early fall years, that we will see slightly, it's not devastating, but slightly below average antlers, and lactation a little bit. But again, it's not nearly as big of a deal for us. And we're never going to see changes in like adult survival. There's never going to be there. I said it again, never. There's rarely going to be any type of adult deer die off. So it's just one of those annual cycles that most deer in the South cope with from year to year. It will just be reflected in what I think is one of the most sensitive indicators of habitat quality, and that's antlers. Gotcha. And remember, again, a little more background biology. Antlers are a luxury. So you exploit antler growth when you have the resources to do that. But body growth always comes first. When we look at year-to-year variation, and you compare year-to-year variation in body size versus antler size varies so much more from year to year than body size, because body size is important for survival. So number one, get your body in shape. Number two, if you have it, grow antlers as big as you can.
And I think that's part of what, like, we talked about last week. Like, it seems like, and even at this part of the year and you know, end of June, that there's so much food for deer out there, like so much browse, so much forb, so much at this time, crops coming up. But
and I can't remember a time that I haven't done like the studies on these, but I can't remember April, May, June, you know, time frame that I ever felt like the rain was affecting habitat in such a way that, you know, fawn recruitment was much lower. Like, it just seems like don't really matter. Yeah, we always get enough rain, for it to not affect the deer.
I think in our area we do, and I think probably in the Southeast they do.
Yeah,
and Texas obviously, or the West when you start talking about even mule deer country and stuff like.
Well, and it makes sense, especially because of I think what I'm taking away from this is that winter precipitation. Yeah, the fact that they've got moisture carried through, or we do rather, you know, gives us a huge advantage during these fawning and antler growing months. But I think it's also fair that conversely, the Northeast especially will deal with much harsher winters. So we've got that other, you know, stress period that maybe Southeast Texas does not.
Yeah,
Southwest Texas.
It's completely flipped. So, Jared, like what you're saying is, we are always where we're at, Jeremy, where you're at. We're always going to have spring green up. It's pretty much always going to be on within a 2 or 3 week. But every once in a while, even in Mississippi, we'll have that rare, you know, the jet stream changes and we'll have that really, really cold snap.
Yeah.
That is a big deal for further north than where you're at. But it's a big deal is when spring green up comes a month later.
Right.
Yeah. And you have deer that were, you know, basically living off fat reserves for several months. And when spring green up comes later, a month later, they run out of fuel and they'll starve to death.
Yeah.
But again, that's really extreme.
Well, in Bronson, we hear about, you know, even though we're in Pennsylvania and we have Punxsutawney Phil, we hear about does being like the the premier weather predictor in terms of trying to maximize when or optimize when their fawn drops with cover, food availability, so that they can, lactate and produce milk. When you have some of these extreme changes, let's say, in the upper peninsula of Michigan or Wisconsin or even into Canada, where green up normally would occur in April, May, and now it's pushed towards the first part of June, and in fact, there were some places that, I know had ice on the lake still until, end of May. Like, how are those does adapting to that? Are they truly trying to like hold that fawn in until those conditions are correct? Or is it just like, hey, we didn't plan right this time and it is what it is?
Hold it in.
Yeah. Just hold it in, pinch it off.
Well, yeah, I don't think that that's occurring. I mean, their biological clock is going to operate. The gestation period is going to be around 200 days, 205 days. And so when they reach their term, they're going to drop those fawns, and you just kind of cross your fingers that it's going to be timed well. And most of the time it is, because that timing, but believe it or not, conception dates are inherited. It's a heritable trait that's passed on from mother to doe fawn. And so on the average, over long periods of time, that is the optimal time to drop a fawn. And so you will have a year to where it didn't match up. We were 3 weeks or a month off. And unfortunately, those fawns are probably going to die. But again, over the duration of that doe's life, most of the time it's going to hit on time and she'll be successful.
And I mean, we talk about these herds. I mean, they're not as, plastic essentially as a ground nesting bird like a turkey or a grouse or a quail, to where, if their first clutch fails, they can go out and lay another clutch and things like that. But, overall, like even if we think about Southwest Texas and stuff, like these herds are still pretty pliable to be able to bounce back. Like you could have an entire year where that fawn recruitment is sub 10%, and it's not like there's no deer, right? I mean, the herd is able to recover fairly quickly, from that kind of bottleneck.
Yeah, and it's kind of a good example there. That's why doe harvest, for example, down in South Texas can be such a big deal compared to where you're at, Jeremy. And it all comes down to fawn survival from year to year to year. And so if you're only having 1 out of every or 2 out of every 5 years having a 30 to 40% fawn crop, and then you go in and over harvest your does, you can radically reduce the deer population, and it may take 10 years or more for it to recover. Jeremy, in your neck of the woods, you over harvest, and I guarantee you in about 3 years, you're back to where you started.
Where we are.
Because of that reliable assembly line of fawns that you're pumping in to the population every year. That's why, like in the Southeast, that is always such a big deal, is you have to manage density through doe harvest because we have fawn survival. I know when I talk to my buddies in Texas, they'd always talk about the luxury that we have, which we don't see it that way because of the labor of doe harvest all the time. But wouldn't it be great to have a 50% fawn crop every single year?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's interesting because like we had the Game Commission in not too long ago, and certain states, I know Mississippi's one too, Texas obviously, very much pay attention to fawn recruitment rates and trends, really, maybe not just based off a single year. In some cases, like Texas, yes, but to determine doe harvest allocations, recommendations. It seems like our state and probably several other like ours, which have, a fairly consistent reproduction rate at least, are very much basing their harvest off of density and in particular kind of effects on native habitat. And so it's just unique to understand. And I'm not saying that either is probably, I would say that from a right way, it would be, yes, our fawn recruitment is, through the floor. We need to not harvest so many does. But it's interesting when you look at some of the, and I guess these are some of the debatable topics with like a Pennsylvania Game Commission or other Northeast agencies, to where they're not necessarily even looking at the population as much as they are the population's effect on the habitat.
Yeah. And that's certainly always a consideration. I know in Mississippi, we have all these different interests that are always lobbying each year, trying to get into the ear of our biologists, commissioners, et cetera, about what's going to be the bag limit the upcoming year. And so just very simply think about this. You have the competing interest of hunters.
Mm-hmm.
Most hunters, they want a lot of deer.
Mm-hmm.
They want to sit in the stand. They want to see a lot of deer. Okay, now what happens if you're a soybean producer? You want a lot of deer or do you want less deer?
You don't want any deer.
Right. All right. What happens if you insure vehicle collisions, deer vehicle collisions? You want less deer.
Yeah.
So it's always, you're never going to make everyone perfectly happy and satisfied with a regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And then one of the ways, Jeremy, like you talked about as well, is looking at the state of your forest,
Mm-hmm.
looking at forest regeneration. You're not thinking about this year, you're thinking about 50 years from now. Are we managing and regenerating the forest? So that's especially a big deal in Pennsylvania and places like that. So you've got all these different angles and people wanting a deer herd the way they want the deer herd to be. And all your state wildlife agencies are trying to come up with a solution that satisfies the greatest amount of people most of the time, knowing that you're never going to make everybody happy.
Yeah.
Is there a number, or like, do you have an opinion on, while we're on the subject of doe harvest, is there a ratio to strive for? Is it more of a population density thing? Like, as we're looking at applying for doe tags specifically, or I even have the opportunity for, these DMAP tags essentially, what kind of numbers should we be looking at? How do you try to determine, what's an appropriate doe harvest from year to year?
Jared, that's really tough for a blanket statement because
just give me a number. I'm just kidding.
Right, Jared, you need to harvest a doe to 50 acres. How about that?
That's about where I'm at.
Yeah, and that may be right on. It may be way off, but
I was totally kidding. I know it's more complex than that.
Is that where you're at, though, you think?
I'd
be, about 20 does in your place?
We're probably a little under that.
Yeah.
But
well, I guess I say that, and Bronson, you bring up a good point. And we talked about this with Matt, is managing people is obviously a heck of a lot harder than managing the wildlife populations in these sectors. But and this kind of ties into both of you guys. But Bronson, I know you guys did some pretty cool research around soybeans and deer damage. And Jared, you just brought it up. Like, you're actually getting, or likely getting, DMAP tags for crop damage on your property this year.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not a farmer, so
right.
The crop damage is my excuse to be able to manage the herd more efficiently.
Just because you don't have the flexibility of just buying a ton of doe tags because you're a non-resident right now.
Right.
So, Bronson, I guess if you would kind of give us an exec summary there of what you guys looked at and what you found there. And that was what, eastern Mississippi, what you were doing?
Yeah, it was within an hour of where we're at, all the different study sites. I believe we had 5 different sites. And so we always have to deal with what do we think most people are dealing with, completely recognizing there's always exceptions. There's going to be a producer that might be managing 3,000 or 4,000 acres of soybeans.
Mm-hmm.
May not have any appreciable damage. Then there may be someone that's trying to, Jared, like you were saying earlier, you planted 6 acres or so. You have some producers that might have 10-acre fields or 15-acre fields, and they're experiencing a tremendous amount of damage. So what we try to do is kind of find what is the happy medium in our area. And so I think we had fields ranging from 10 to 15 acres all the way up to over 50 acres. And I still remember this. The first time I gave a public meeting in front of some producers and told them our results, I didn't fear for my life, but I thought I was going to get beat up.
Wow. Really?
I got the stink eye pretty bad, because rightfully so from some people, is because that was not their experience. Mm-hmm. Their experience was significant damage. But what we learned in general was that deer were not causing damage to the extent of affecting bushels per acre. There was no appreciable, significant difference. What we found that I thought was kind of interesting psychologically was that when you see deer in a field, you see the average height of those plants lower because of browsing. So you automatically come to conclusion that that's causing me damage. Go out in these fields and we would do it once a week through the whole growing season. We had a little FLIR unit, we would count the number of deer, et cetera. We know how many were out there and using it. And then we set up exclosure cages radiating from the woods or the crop margin all the way to the interior of the field. And you could certainly see the average height of the beans, get greater and greater and greater as you got to the interior of the field.
Right.
But surprisingly, most of that effect was not due to deer. It was due to what we would call a border effect. So compaction around the edge of the field, shading due to, in our case,
shading is a big one.
Pine trees causing. So you would see, no doubt about it, when we had the unprotected beans and the protected beans would be a little bit taller. So deer were affecting the height of the beans because they were browsing the tissue. But at the end, when you got to August, September, et cetera, and it came time to get the combine out and you weighed the amount of yield in those slightly shorter beans versus the taller beans, there was no significant difference at all. And then when I got to talking to some of my colleagues, so this has been replicated in both the Delaware as well as in Indiana, there's actually a sweet spot. And can you manage for this? Probably not, but it's interesting to think about. There's actually, believe it or not, a sweet spot where some browsing increases soybean yield. And so a light level of browsing causes more branching, and then that's going to produce more pods and more yield. And so we just saw, in our case, everything balanced out. It's like, there are some cases maybe right on the border. You've got the border effect from shading and compaction exacerbated by deer browsing where, deer having an impact. But when you looked at the entirety of that whole field and you counted on this field, we had a lot of deer, on this field, we had few deer, et cetera, and you run the numbers, we did not see any big effect at all.
That's interesting.
And that was not very popular.
Yeah, I think in talking to, the local state agent, the guy that issues these DMAP tags in our area of Ohio, basically said that to me as well. He's like, it's possible, but there is no real instances where we're seeing like dramatic decreases in yield, like you said, per bushel. And that the tags that he's issuing are basically just to keep the farmers happy. Like they see deer in their farm and they're like, okay, like what do you want? Some tags or whatever. And
I think that's interesting. I mean, it goes back to even from a year over year, like think about first of all, think about the number of insurance claims that are happening around deer damage to that'd be USDA. Is that what most of those things are?
Probably more crop insurance.
Crop insurance side.
Yeah.
And I assume they have to have some sort of validation, right, or inspection that this is legitimate. But think about the other factors from what we just talked about. Too much rain, too little rain, late soil temps rising so that they got the actual, planting done later. Like there's so many other factors that come into play. It's kind of like when we always used to say, guys would go out and plant a food plot and they'd be like, yeah, it just didn't grow. Like just bad seed didn't grow. And it's like, well, do you have an exclosure cage on it? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, the deer probably just ate it all. Well, no. It just didn't grow. Meanwhile, if you put a cage on that thing, it'd be 2 feet tall inside that cage. Right. And so these farmers just, because you can't isolate factors, instantly look at it and say, my bushels are down. It's deer damage.
Yeah. And so let me back up a little bit too. This is not to say that deer damage is not occurring in some places at some times, because we absolutely know it is. Here's a great example, Jeremy. You remember our big flood in the Mississippi Delta 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so literally, I mean, this is an overwhelming number. You got 700,000 acres underwater. So you pushed a whole bunch of deer into new areas temporarily. And, there's drone footage, photos, et cetera, where, those producers could not get a soybean crop out of the ground. And because they had 2 times, 3 times, 4 times or more deer on the field causing damage.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always cases where the number of deer, you've got way too many deer relative to the acreage of soybean that's being planted, and it's going to be a problem.
Sure.
But,
And I mean, in general. And there were some weird circumstances with that at that time, because wasn't when that flooding occurred, there was a lot of the hunting seasons or areas were shut down as well?
Yeah. So it started like closer to the rivers, but they had to shut the seasons down. 2 weeks early, sometimes a month early, but because of that, deer were just too vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
They were out of cover. They were relegated to hanging out on levees. And completely exposed, and so they terminated the season a little early because of that.
And that's crazy. I mean, because then if I'm a stakeholder as a farmer, I'm looking at, I need those harvests in order to control this population, because not only are they jammed up on my place, they're, now you just reduce the number of deer that have been harvested. And yes, some probably fell victim to natural conditions and flooding and things like that. But, that hunting aspect is our population management.
Yeah. And so there's another great example like we talked about earlier. So Jeremy, you remember the levee, the levee that protects, it's between the river and between the soybean fields. So there you got a levee there. And on one side of the levee, you have recreational properties. Those properties are bought and leased to deer hunt, to duck hunt. They want, I'm not going to say a lot of deer, but they want a thriving deer herd. On the other side of the levee is someone trying to make a living with the corn and soybean operation. And now we have completely pushed all of the deer out of the recreational property up onto the levee. And now they're completely exposed to all this acreage of soybean. Who's right? Well, they both have a valid perspective. You have some people that paid a lot of money for property. They're paying property taxes. They have an interest in keeping as many deer as possible. Other side of the levee, same situation. They're trying to make a living off soybeans. So it's tough. It's always tough to manage that kind of situation.
I think one of the things that we kind of got in a discussion with Jeff Sturgis about this, and, my conditions are a little bit different than Jared's, which is probably a little different than what you guys are dealing with down there. But, one of the interesting factors, and this is kind of arising from the whole soybean discussion, is, and whether right or wrong, Jeff Sturgis is very adamant that in most areas there's not a need for summer annual plantings and or even perennials in some cases, because there's so much ag around to support. And again, even different from ag, native habitat, high quality native habitat that's providing vegetation, that those things aren't needed. My area, I don't have that. I don't have ag anywhere. I have native habitat, and it is what it is. But
and just to clarify, I don't think he's saying they're not necessary, as much as he's saying like there are other crops or food plot, seed blends that you could plant that are more advantageous to determining what your deer herd is, how it's going to be influenced from year to year.
Yeah. Well, but in the summer, he's not planting summer annuals.
Right.
He's not doing it.
Right.
There's farmers are planting crops. I don't need to plant it.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting thing because obviously, when you start to look at how different plants mature, and let's focus on soybeans because I'm not really worried about the corn aspect here. I'm worried more about soybean. When those soybeans are planted, and let's even say this time of year in June, they're probably at the damn close to the highest crude protein level that they're going to be their entire life cycle, right? And slowly, as they weather and grow and become more fibrous, that crude protein level decreases, the digestibility decreases. I just wonder when we start to talk about some of these other ones, Berseem clover being one, Bronson, like, I'm not saying that there isn't food out there, and obviously there's only so much protein and things like that that a deer can take in, but like, are we missing some opportunities by not having, a parallel summer annual as that soybean matures? There's a ton of food, but it's not nearly as good as it was in May and June. That's what I'm looking at.
So what's your question?
I'm saying, should we be planning parallel summer annuals because those
to what? Parallel to what?
To the soybeans that the farmers are planting.
Oh, well, I think that's Jeff's argument, and it's one that I agree with, is that natural vegetation in the Midwest and the Northeast is more than enough, especially if you're in an agricultural area that also has soybeans and stuff. Mm-hmm. I agree with Jeff in that regard. I don't plant soybeans because I think my deer need a summer annual with high.
You're planning it to hunt over.
I'm planning it to hunt. Well, I'm planning it for two reasons. Because of how my farm lies in relation to neighboring ag ground and stuff like that. We have a lot of deer in the summer months anyways, regardless of what food plots I plant. More so even than during the fall months, which from a Jeff's standpoint and from like a deer hunting, if I'm looking for a property, is not the best case scenario. You want something where the deer in October, November, December in some cases are spending a majority of their time. So in Jeff's words, you can be the herd influencer.
Sure.
However, I've taken my situation and understanding that these deer, these bucks anyways, are here in the summers anyways. And I use soybeans not to encourage antler growth necessarily or to keep them there in the summer because they're already there. But it's to keep them there. It's one, to keep them there the first few weeks of the season. I've noticed that if I plant a few weeks later than
commercial ag guys,
the farmers around me, the deer are already there. And if they've still got green soybeans, come October 1st, they're going to stay there for a week, 2 weeks, long enough for me to have some good hunting opportunities over them. And then the thing this is where I kind of disagree with Jeff, is and a lot of guys seem to overlook like the later season benefits of soybeans. Is that I've got a premium, mid to late season food source that stands above snowfall, which we get quite a bit of later in the season here. So it's a great tool for me to, one, like I said, keep those deer there for hunting opportunities early in October to mid October, and then later in the season. And then I fill in the gaps with something that is in line with Jeff's strategy of just, a lot of mass putting on. So, brassicas and rye for attractability.
So I guess, Bronson, what we're looking at there is like maybe walk our listeners through some of the things, whether it's from a food plot or crop or native habitat perspective, but the kind of maturing process of these plants through the summer, and really focusing around, I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, two things that I look at from a deer standpoint for their stomach is nutrition, the nutrients actually in it, and then digestibility. Because I think a lot of people overlook that last factor, which is critical into what they can get out of the plant.
Yeah. I didn't see the conversation that with Jeff Sturgis y'all are referring to, but I guess I would just comment.
Here, I'll give you just a little more context too with Jeff. So, like I said, he doesn't, it's not that he doesn't like soybeans, but he prefers buckwheat, primarily because it is a really good cover crop for a fall annual, which he prefers. So that's his argument, is not soybeans, buckwheat that I can broadcast and break over on top of brassicas and rye.
Yeah. So I would say we can't make a rule that's going to cover everybody. So I think we could go into your region and come up with a situation to where summer food plots make no sense at all, and a situation to where they make perfect sense. Certainly from a perspective of, if you have agriculture all around you, and a lot of that being soybean, it may not make any sense to also plant a summer food plot. I would probably err on the side of doing it for a year or two and monitoring the use of it.
Yep.
With the feedback to me being that if there are soybeans over there, hundreds and hundreds of acres, but deer are still using my summer food plot, there may be some nutrient provided by a particular clover or some other plant that deer need, and they are seeking it out. So Jeremy, again, back to the exclusion cage. Are deer using it? Well, if deer are using it, then they think they need it, they're attracted to it, and so I'm going to keep doing it. If they're not using it, then I'm probably, whether it be a light rate of buckwheat, maybe you're going to let that cool season plot just go fallow, provide a diversity of your naturally occurring vegetation to again provide plant diversity for your deer. If all you have is closed canopy forest adjacent to soybeans, believe it or not, you are still limiting your deer on diet quality. You have a fantastic, one of the best plants in the world with soybean, but deer need more than soybean. That's why they still will go to a food plot and have a feeding bout. And then you'll see them browsing through the woods. They're balancing all of these other nutrients as well. So I would not make a rule of yes or no. With every situation, I would try it and see how the deer respond to it. And then that would inform me if I'm going to keep going with something like a soybean plot in that region.
Yeah, kind of just like an interesting side note. So Jed Coldwell is a friend and a neighbor of mine at this farm in Ohio, and his farm is primarily timber, much more timber, whereas mine's got more ag to it. And he plants food plots, a couple acres, and I've seen them recently. He does just of a diversity. Like he'll do a little 1/8 acre of clover here with like a 1/4 acre of brassicas here, with some oats or something thrown in over here. And like his observation is that they get hit very consistently. Like if he's sitting over a field in October or November and deer are using that just the field, they're in every part of it. He says they're just all over the place.
Like foraging like a buffet.
Yeah, like you would almost think you'd see the deer like, oh, they're really hitting the radishes right now, or they're really hitting the clover right now. And that may be the case in some areas, but he's saying he's not seeing that at all. He's like, they're in every part of it at all times.
Well, I assume that, every different species of plants has different nutrient content there that, we know that whitetails are very selective in the forages that they're eating and maximizing the amount of nutrients that they're pulling for the effort of actually consuming. So, that's why they're different than cattle or whatever that'll just go in and mow down, full field. They'll browse through selecting what in theory is the highest nutrition value plant for them. Yeah. Bronson, can you talk to us a little bit about digestibility? Because that's something as we get into summer, especially as we get into later summer, our food plots are going to experience, native habitat's going to experience it, soybeans are going to experience it. And I think it's a factor that, people will talk about, there's 30% crude protein in soybeans at some point of the year, but not always, right? And I think that's where I'm kind of saying, I guess, a little different than what Jeff is saying here, in that, like, if I have something around berseem clover or even a really good white clover perennial plot, the digestibility of that plot is way better than soybean.
Yeah, especially since, it seems like the crude protein level is maybe a more level playing field than we thought at one time. Like there's a lot of, even like, what's the one? It's not goldenrod, but it's, there's a couple just, native forages.
Well, greenbrier and stuff is.
What's that one that overtook my clover plot that one year? It was like real tall and stemmy, and I was like all worked up about it, but come to find out, ragweed, yeah. It's like just as high in protein as.
Enlighten us, Bronson.
Soybean.
I know you got wheelhouse stuff here.
Luckily, from a food plot perspective and agricultural crops and so forth, they are generally very digestible. meaning that whether you're planting most of your clovers, cereal grains for most of the year, brassicas, etc., digestibility usually isn't near of an issue as you see with natural vegetation. That digestibility becomes a big part. And a lot of that is what we spoke about earlier. It's the growth process of the plant. And so that growing tissue has less fiber, less lignin in it. It's higher in protein. And then as the plant begins to mature, I mean, you can physically see this and feel this as it becomes more upright and more sturdy. It becomes more firm, and that is because of the fiber that's in it. And there's a direct correlation. The more fiber, the less digestible it is. I generally, Jeremy, don't, I guess it's a concern, but it's one of those I really don't feel I can do much about. And the reason I say that is I think that if you have a diversity of food plot forages and simultaneously you have managed your habitat where you have a diversity of naturally occurring plants, the deer are going to self-select in what is most nutritious and most digestible, literally from month to month. And so I don't know. I mean, can you do things like, Jared, you mentioned that there's some merit to that, maybe planting a little bit later so that maturation is a little bit later in the year compared to, the agricultural crop. We've spoken about that earlier with the natural maturation of different clovers.
Yep.
So something like a crimson clover matures earlier than, say, a Berseem clover or a red clover. You're just taking advantage in that regard of that natural process of when it grows, it goes to seed, matures. And when it does that, the nutrient quality is going to go down, digestibility is going to go down.
Yeah. And I think that's where, trying to look at these plans, right? Because at the end of the day, we just want those deer to be there when we hunt them, right? It'd be great to affect them in a positive light throughout antler growing and body season, which we could talk about here in a second. But I mean, if they disappear come October 1, who cares? So I think it's from an understanding of how can we do things on our property, whether it's planting a food plot or the other thing is, I know Marcus Lashley did those small like tree stand area burns, which literally set the habitat back in a shooting area around a tree stand. Like those little things like that. And it seems crazy, but there's plenty of people out there that I'm sure are even listening to this that are looking for just small tweaks and edge advantages that, they've probably been planting food plots for so long and trying different varieties and they've got crops and they're doing timber stand improvement. Like what are the small things? Like if I look at it, I guess from that standpoint, Bronson, like if I had a really strong clover plot come August when a lot of my native habitat is fibrous and thus less digestible and thus less nutrients being able to kick, that's a big advantage to my deer going into the fall, I would say. Versus not planning or not doing anything for that standpoint. And as we get closer, I'm basically on a weird holding pattern where they're eating fibrous native forage and waiting for acorns to fall.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And so, Jeremy, what we call that term ecologically is disturbance.
Mm-hmm.
So can we disturb the soil? And whether it's something we plant or whether it's something that's naturally going to grow, but a combination. Here's something that a lot of people can do if they plant food plots that's really neglected: fall disking. And so just going into an area, so every single opening you have does not have to be in a food plot. You can just go in starting one particular fall and disc it up, disturb the soil, and get your native plants growing, and do that every other year. Mm-hmm. That's going to be another source of plant. The other would be like with what Marcus did with the bow range burning stuff. And this can be really helped by if you have created a canopy gap in your forest. And so go in, cut down some trees, girdle some trees, however you want to do it, get some sunlight on the ground. It doesn't have to be a big acreage. I mean, we're talking a quarter acre, half an acre, something like that. And then come summertime, set fire to it, burn it. And then you're going to get the response. And again, you're going to get a better response if fire is paired with sunlight. You won't see near the number of plants grow in the shade versus in the sun.
Mm-hmm.
So creating some canopy gaps, disturbing the soil, in this case with fire, and you can create all sorts of little situations like that for hunting.
Yeah, I think the disturbance one is really interesting and overlooked.
Yeah, people feel the need, if it's an opening, to plant it.
Yeah, well, and like, so I've had some instances where I'm like, well, our farm is lacking cover. So what I need to do is plant CRP.
Yeah, native orb season grasses.
And you know, I think Jeff's got some good instructional videos, and we should get him on at some point with the four of us or whatever. But you know, he's got a process where it's pretty easy to plant CRP, and it's manageable and stuff. But you know, I've got 20, 30, 40 acres of this stuff. I would consider, I'd love to have it in some kind of a cover, and certainly food if I could at the same time. And that CRP just seems just out of reach, like to where every year it slips by, and I'm like, just maybe not this year. But man, if I could just like muster myself up in the end of October or in November, one of these falls, to go into those areas, it's just cool season grasses that have died off at that point, and to run a disc through it. I've seen the benefits on a smaller scale of what that can do for the coming years in way of natural forbs and stuff. So I think that's a really good solution.
Yeah. I mean, Bronson, when we, and I know
paired with a chainsaw is one of the best tools. Yeah.
I know it's going to vary at different parts of the country, but I mean, talk about native forage. Like, what are like our top 5 there in terms of what we're looking at from a native forb or forage standpoint? You know, taking out acorns and things like that from just a plant basis.
It's a very intimidating list of plants, and I feel like I say this over and over, meaning that it's different from place to place.
Sure.
But man, when you do some of these studies that, you know, go back to the 1980s and so forth, it can be 100 different plants that deer are selecting. What is difficult to tease apart is, are they selecting that plant because they have to or because they choose to?
Right.
Do they prefer it? And that's always, they can only prefer something if it's available.
Yep.
So we have all those issues there, but certainly down here, ragweed is a big one. Pokeweed is a big one. Goldenrod is often neglected. Wild lettuce. I was on the highway this past weekend for a couple hours, and I was on Highway 20 going from Mississippi to Georgia, and I kept noticing wild lettuce in the median of the interstate. And right now it can be 4 foot to 6 foot high.
Wow.
And so it was very conspicuous. I was going by, look at that wild lettuce, look at that wild lettuce. And then I thought, I'm never seeing it on the right side of the road, buffering the forest, and that's because the deer were hammering
it.
Yeah. So that's a good one. We have an abundance of rubus, so blackberry. Blackberry can be one of those where you typically have a lot of it, especially if sunlight is hitting the ground. They're never gonna eat the entire plant because of what we were talking about earlier. It becomes very fibrous and non-digestible. But you always have those growing tips that you can see. They actually radiate light a little bit differently. Deer are going to hammer that. Of course, your greenbrier is going to be, and that's one of the ones.
All of which is we have here. I mean, that's what I'm saying is like it's, you know, we're talking to you guys, which is 14 hours south of us. We have those same plants here, which I would agree are probably most used. In fact, I think out of all of those, I think people kind of know like your blackberries, your greenbrier, you know, deer eating those things, right? I mean, you can see the browse. I think the ragweed is an interesting one because when people hear ragweed, they think allergies and bad stuff and kill it. That's what they do.
That year that it overtook it was a clover plot that I'd planted, and it looked like I planted ragweed, like it was a healthy stand. and the deer were crushing it. Like I went out in there and they were just destroyed. Like the tops were all nipped off.
Yeah.
I was like kind of blown away.
And I think that's an interesting piece because we have, and again, this is part of the industry thing, which I get it, but like the hunting industry has forced this down our throat that if we have an opening, we got to plan it, right? And it should be this, and that weeds are bad. And, you know, I think that when you start to look at it from a habitat standpoint, like, first of all, planting food plots costs money, takes time, right? And so when you start to think of like leaving a plot fallow or dropping a disc and promoting native vegetation, like if we can get across to people like, hey, if you grow an acre plot of ragweed, awesome, man. Like, let it go.
That's just the human element, I think, of like
Mowing.
We want to control nature. Like, yeah, I want that field clean cut, and I want this food plot clean void of weeds, and that's not necessarily the most advantageous to wildlife.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I know pokeweed is one that I've kind of I like a lot. So I had
the same as like pokeberry.
Yeah,
like the tall.
Yep.
Okay.
Has the black berries look like grapes on it?
Yes.
Yeah. So I had at my house, actually, I had a really nasty stand of like Japanese stilt grass and stuff that came up and not weed. And like it was tough to kill. And I mean, I'm talking like a whole area looked like a closed canopy of this, like, looks like bamboo when it dies out. And so, I mean, I nuked this thing. I mean, for multiple years, and I'm still fighting that battle. Like every year, I'm like out there with my chemicals. My neighbors think I'm like crazy, but but what came back in its place?
Because you're in your underwear.
Well, yeah,
with a gas mask on.
I should probably put pants on next time.
They probably think you're cooking meth.
Look like I just came out of Breaking Bad. Yeah. So, but what came back in its place is pokeberry and pokeweed, and like it's lined this whole area, and like usually I think in our area it's like late August, early September when you see that thing start to mature, and you're like, man, you know, like these bushes look great. The next week they're gone. They'll literally eat those things out. And I think a lot of it too, we talk about drought stuff, the water content in those things is outrageous. But yeah, I mean, they hammer that thing to the ground.
You just both of y'all brought up points I think are worth commenting on. You know, Jeremy, I think this is something that's real intuitive to someone with a biological background, but surprisingly, and I don't mean this in any demeaning way, I just think you have to think about it for a little bit.
Sometimes not so surprisingly.
Deer evolved eating weeds.
Yeah.
Literally for tens of thousands of years, that is their diet. So to think that you have to go plant something to have a viable deer population is crazy. We always try to use the word to supplement and to enhance. That is what we're doing with those type of practices, is that maybe you don't have the acreage. Maybe you're like in the Southeast, you lease land, it's owned by a timber company. You just don't have a lot of acres that are open where sunlight is hitting the ground. What is a good thing you can do? Plant a food plot. Let's grow succulent vegetation that deer are going to eat. But to always think that those weeds are bad, it does not make any biological sense, because that is the very foundation of what deer evolved to eat. Jared, the point you brought up earlier that people don't think about is when you were talking about, I think you said it was a clover plot, and then you came back a few months later and it was, you know, dominated by ragweed. Did you plant the ragweed?
No, I planted the clover.
You planted the clover. Where did the ragweed come from? From decades, literally decades of ragweed seed were in the ground waiting to be turned over and disturbed to have the right combination of soil temperature, sunlight, etc. And you released all of that naturally occurring seed. Yeah. So just think of what you could do every year on just a few acres of your property with a disc.
Yeah. Well,
think how you enhance it.
And while I was, you know, off put by the fact that there was ragweed growing in my clover, it pissed me off.
Aesthetically
frankly.
off put.
Well, no, just yes, but also I was like, man, I planted clover. I want the clover to grow. If I were to go out and disc just to agitate the soil, I would be, elated if I could get that kind of a turnout of ragweed. I'd be like, man, this is awesome. Because all I'm getting now is just, cool season grasses that are great for fawning and stuff, but ultimately are pretty worthless.
Well, it's because your place was a pasture at one point.
Yeah,
so
a lot
it
of
was
it's
very pasture, cattle ground basis.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it is something that it's the aesthetics, right? It's why people mow. Like, I don't know. It's not that I'm saying don't go and mow clover plots or whatever, right? But frankly, I don't do it. I never have, and I don't know if I ever will. I do spray when I'm actually trying to manage grasses, especially in perennials. I don't usually spray my broadleafs unless they're shading out clover or something.
I've never had good luck killing grass out of clover, ever.
It's tough.
Even with like the arrest stuff, like that seems to be the go-to, and I mix it with like soap and stuff, and I just never really works.
Yeah, but it's the like
probably glyphosate's the only thing that really if you hit a light round of glyphosate, because the clover's pretty resistant,
especially if you have
like that.
Yeah, I've had a lot of success controlling grass in clover
with clethodim.
Yeah, I'm not getting a kickback from that company, but yeah, clethodim.
Huh. Yeah, is that the arrest product?
It's probably a form. Arrest is Whitetail Institute's.
Right.
So
I think it is
clethodim is like the
clethodim.
Active chemical.
Yeah, that's the ingredient.
Yep.
Jared, typically what happens when you fail to control grass is the timing. Is that you got to go out there and you have to see it growing. So you have to literally get it in that vulnerable, like we're talking about with deer forage before it matures. Mm-hmm. You have to get it while it's actively growing. So a lot of times when you go out there and see it and it's already knee high or higher, you're going to get a very incomplete kill. But if you're out there, say during turkey season, you already see that grass coming up in between the clover and hit it at that time, you can be very successful.
Can we, I know we pissed a bunch of people off with moon phase last time Bronson was on. Can we piss people off again? Bronson, sure. What's your take on mowing clovers?
Well, I will say this. I have never personally done any research on that, but I have a good friend and colleague who's done a tremendous amount of research quantifying exactly the effects of doing that. And that's Dr. Craig Harper from the University of Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And he even though he has done it for years and years and talked about it, they had a very rigorous and systematic study that they presented at the Southeastern Deer Study Group this past year. And there was no benefit whatsoever to mowing your clover.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, there was no benefit in terms of yield, your biomass, your clover biomass. And I believe I'd have to go back and look in terms of weeds and different things like that for controlling that. The bottom line was don't mow. That there was no tangible, appreciable benefit. Not only that, you were decreasing the amount of clover forage available to deer.
Don't mow. That'll be a good clip.
What was the comment about weed control? Because that's the primary reason you cut clover, right? Is to kill broadleafs out of it.
I think he would say, why aren't you could do that with an herbicide better. So yeah. And definitively kill the plant with an herbicide versus mowing it, but because you are sacrificing your clover production by doing that.
I think the things, at least when I ask people why they mow, number one, they won't say it. It's aesthetics. They want to mow the clover. They just do. People want to mow it. I think
I bet even more people they don't know why. They just think you're supposed to cut clover.
They just think, that's why I want to bring this up, because it's such a hot. Number one is I think people mow at the wrong times. Ground nesting birds, fawns. There's a ton of stuff there that I think that cause issues. Clover, your effects on your clover, but people mow because number one, they think that if they mow when it gets taller, that it's going to enhance production, right? Biomass is going to increase. Obviously, doesn't seem like that's true. Number two, per what we've been talking about, is the more mature the clover gets, the less digestible, and so I'm going to set it back and things like that. Doesn't seem like that's probably statistically significant, I would assume.
Yeah, so Jeremy, I think, I hope I'm capturing the process here. I would say, yep, Jared, there are some weed concerns you might be trying to control. I think most people think they are regenerating the stand, that it's older, it's lignified, etc. And so we're going to increase the quality of the clover by stimulating more growth. But here is what Craig has quantified and his students very well, is that I'm going to have to talk with my hands here. So forgive me, but so let's say this is one particular.
You could be here. Sorry.
You have this canopy of one clover plant.
Yep.
Here's its canopy, and the edge, the growing edge of that is the biomass that is of highest quality, lowest fiber content, etc. So even though the growth may not be as accelerated as when you mow it, you still have this great amount, this canopy of biomass. And on the fringes of that, you have all of this high quality clover tissue. Okay, so that is unmowed. Now, let's take this big canopy of a clover plant and let's chop that whole canopy off. And now we have this little clover plant, and it does have this new canopy that is forming, and it is of very high quality, and it is very digestible, etc. But let's look at the amount of the previous canopy of the tissue that was growing on the edges versus now the smaller plant and this reduced canopy and the amount of tissue that is growing. The unmowed plant was producing a far greater amount of high quality tissue.
I mean, I would argue too that if you cut that larger canopy out, you're providing more room for weeds and grasses to grow in as well.
You are, for sure.
Right? I mean, in effect, what you thought you were doing to control weeds and grasses is actually promoting more space for them to funnel in.
You may have released some that were being protected or diminished by the canopy itself. You've now released it. That's certainly possible too.
It also seems like if the deer herd alone isn't keeping the clover at a fresh level, like you probably have too much clover. You probably benefit.
I don't know,
and
I mean, I think I've had that discussion. Like, and I've got some really, really great stands of perennial white clover up on the mountain, to where, like, right now, if you went into them, they're probably getting close to knee high. I mean, and there's weeds and stuff in it, but I mean, it's a great stand. By the time I get to, and I don't mow it, right, by the time I get to November, it's this tall because the deer have just ate it all down.
Yeah.
And so I think that
I think what's going on there, I've spent a lot of time looking at our data with our former student, Jacob Dykes. We did this food plot study, different plants all throughout the year, when are deer on it, when are they using it, et cetera. And on every single plot, we had several trail cameras. So we're always counting how many deer are using a particular plot. And what was very counterintuitive was that when the food plot, let's just say in February or early March, when there was the least amount of biomass, food plot biomass on those plots, the deer were on those plots more.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's counterintuitive is that when late March and April comes around, soil temperatures increase, and then you see that flush of clover growth, you just naturally think now deer are going to be all over it because of that growth. And that's not what happens at all.
They had alternatives.
Spring green up.
Yep.
For our latitude, that is precisely when spring green up. So you have this wide diversity of different plants that are growing and coming online, and deer are choosing. Now they're balancing their diet with all these other different plants. They're still using the clover plot, but the whole reason they were on it so much, like you said in November, Jeremy, or in February, in a lot of places, even though on our study area, it is a very well-managed habitat, there's just not a lot of green growing plants in February. Yep. So that's really what's there. And that's when the deer hit it hardest.
I think that's interesting. I mean, and so for that reason, like I've always, when I plant perennials, I'm looking to fill gaps between my annuals, at least on a food plot cycle. But if you think about it from a larger deer diet standpoint, you know, like I love having all that clover right now, whether they're like, I've seen deer in it, they're using it, but like I know at some point all of that biomass is going to be consumed by that deer herd, which is a fantastic feeling to know that it's there and it's going to get consumed. And so I think it's an interesting strategy when you start to look at why people are planting something like a clover or why they're not planting clover.
I think it's a lot more useful or critical in your situation than it is in mine.
Yeah, because I have no ag.
Yeah,
I have native habitat and whatever I plant.
Surrounded by ag, and I've done a lot of timber work that I think a lot of those forbs and stuff in spring green up are greening up at the same time as my clover.
So I guess let's take your scenario.
Can I share what I've done and what I'm gonna do this year?
Let me ask you one question though first. Do that.
Yeah,
so
okay.
you killed Fuzzy Wuzzy in what, West Twin or East Twin?
East Twin.
East Twin, which was a clover plot at that time.
Yeah, with a corn pile in the middle of it.
Well, that tends to enhance the attractiveness.
Yeah, the deer was coming to a corn pile.
That said, that plot was, from what I can remember,
getting used,
was really good though. Like that was a really good clover
I had
plot.
a lot of does in there.
Do you see what I see on the mountain, even with all the ag, that like at this time of the year, is that clover like thick right now?
Yep.
And then does it get eaten down?
Yep.
See, it's just interesting because even in different habitat, like at some point in the year, deer are choosing to eat that clover over everything else that they have.
Yeah, mine doesn't seem so heavily browse as it does like just.
We need to put a cage on it next week. When
just the weather. I have actually. Yeah, and I've never noticed a substantial getting eaten down. It just seems like the clover breaks down over time. Like by the time November comes around, like it's just
from frost and stuff.
Yeah, it's just kind of gotten broken down. But, so
this white clover, Jared?
Yeah, it's a mix. It's like a Whitetail Institute's imperial clover.
Yeah. All right, go ahead. Now
I
you
believe.
can do your stuff.
So here's from all these conversations that we've had and just my experience over the past 5 or 6 years planting food plots on this property. Here's where I'm at with it right now. I'm reducing the amount of clover that I have. At one time, I had probably 2.5 acres of that. I just don't think that it's necessary.
What's your total food plot acreage for Bronson?
We'll probably end up with close to 10.5 acres of food plots.
Which isn't that technically, like if we have to lay a rule of thumb, it's usually 20% in perennials? Is that what's typically recommended?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good rule of thumb, sure.
It's a 1,000-acre piece of property. We're planting about 10.5 acres of food plots, and there's probably an additional 200 to 300 acres of crops on it that the farmer plants, and those are probably 50-50 corn and beans. So here's what I'm doing. So I've reduced the amount of clover because I don't think that it's as attractive during the hunting season or necessary because of a bunch of the chainsaw work that I've done. I've TSI'd almost every acre of timber on that property, of which there's 300 to 400. I'm increasing the amount of brassicas or biomass, type of plants that I'm planting this year. So those fall plots, I'm going to do almost every fall plot is going to be, I think, a brassica mix, like a turnip, radish, rape, all of those, not including cereal grains. At maybe a few months ago, I was like, man, how do I also include a cereal grain in this to increase attractability and stuff? I just don't think you can. I don't think the two will live well with one another. So I like Jeff's approach of, using the cereal grains and also using buckwheat as a cover crop for that. But I don't want to give up my soybeans in lieu of buckwheat. So I'm going to use the farmer's corn as my buckwheat, essentially, because I can seed into it the same way that I would for buckwheat. So at the end of all this, I'm going to have a substantial, when I say substantial, 6.5 acres and 3 different plots of soybeans for my early season strategy, as I said, and also late season food. All of my fall plots, these half-acre openings, of which I've got, maybe 2 to 2.5 acres worth of, are going to be in brassicas. And I'm going to do an additional, 1.5 acres to 2 acres of rye or oats, or, one of these cereal grains that I'm going to broadcast into the farmer's corn. And that's going to be my strategy. And I still have about 1/2 acre to 1 acre of clover in kind of smaller sections.
I don't see anything wrong with that. I really I thought you were going to there for a minute totally rely on clover and brassicas and completely neglect the cereal grain. So I'm glad to hear you say that. And that probably a lot of bias from down here is that deer are very, very attracted to cereal grains, especially in the early part of winter, because they are growing so much more than, say, clovers or even in our case, brassicas sometimes of that part of year. So, Jared, I think what you've done there is you've provided a great amount of diversity, and you're going to allow deer to choose. So you're going to have some corn, soybean. Did you say you were also going to overseed? You're going to let the soybean stand?
Yep, they're going to stand.
Okay. And were you going to overseed into that as well?
I don't see the opportunity for it. I don't think I can.
I mean, it'll be early October before those leaves start to turn, I would assume,
right,
and open up opportunity.
Well, they'll be green into mid-October.
Then again, I don't know. I mean, Bronson, could you, in theory, because it's shady, right? I mean, that's the thing.
That's why I'm choosing corn over soybeans,
right,
to seed into.
Yeah.
And frankly, the only thing that I'm not totally satisfied with in my plan is that initially, first of all, I haven't done a whole lot of cereal grains in the past. So I was like, my main objective this year was to infuse cereal grains into my food plot strategy. At first, I wanted really badly to find a way to do that in the exact same location as my fall food plots, my brassicas. It would be amazing if I could do cereal grains and brassicas, get that all in one spot. It just doesn't seem like I can do that. So I've elected to, just broadcast them into a crop that I think, will act as somewhat of a cover. Not really, but at least can be broadcast into where soybeans cannot.
Just shade it out.
And that's really why Jeff prefers the buckwheat, is because I can broadcast into it and it works as a cover crop.
I mean, I don't see, although it is later, I don't see why you couldn't in mid-September go in and throw cereal grains in your soybean. It's not going to grow real well, but the moment it does get sunlight and any warm I mean, that's one of the big benefits of cereal grain, right, Bronson? And that, like, even if it's October and we get some rain and some right soil temps, like, that stuff's going to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and even think, Jared, something like wheat is so relatively cheap. That is something I would at least try. And that's always what you're doing on every piece of property and every single plot, is trying different things to see what is most successful. Down here, of course, our growth cycle is a little bit more accelerated, but we're starting to see that more and more and more, is that you will have a soybean crop and then you can go in with an annual clover, but choosing a clover that is going to reseed itself. And so most commonly it would be crimson clover or balança clover. But once you get through that first year, is you can then drill corn, and it might have to be a little bit later, but you'll have a standing crop of corn. And then when it starts to mature and die, is then you will see the naturally reseeded clover from the previous year begin to emerge in the fall. And so you'll have your grain from the corn standing, and then you'll have the high protein from the clover beneath. And I was just suggesting with the beans, because it's so cheap, you might want to start with something like wheat and just see what kind of germination you get. And that might be another way to add another choice for a deer in that plot.
That's fair.
It would be cheap if it failed.
Sure. I will say I've seen, so we've done these beans before, and like It just doesn't see. I mean, it really has a canopy on them almost through the end of October. And so by the time these things germinate, we're going to be almost like into November. And it just seems like such a small window, you know, whereas the stuff that I broadcast into corn is going to germinate
quick,
relatively quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I also, you jogged my memory on something here, and it seems like you're probably the most knowledgeable to tell us about this. At where I'm at this farm here in Ohio, it almost seems like I've got more natural clover than I do grass. I'm talking like it's everywhere, and I don't know what kind of clover it is, but I mean, I don't know. Like, is it advantageous for me to keep planting clover when I'm talking like they're just clover fields
from your old pastures,
just old pastures that have turned into they're just clover.
I would assume it's probably red clover, some sort of red clover.
Yeah,
would be
no
my
idea.
guess.
My guess would be it could be red. Down here, white clover, just because it's a perennial, is often interseeded in with your perennial forage grasses.
Mm.
I don't know what that would be up there at fescue, maybe.
Probably.
But not quite often here.
And I guess the question is, like, did you hit that just as much? Like, is that as good or better than the clover that I'm planting in a food plot, or not as good?
I wouldn't say it's any better. I'm sure it has very similar nutrient quality, even though it's old and established and been there. It's probably very similar.
That's interesting.
So yeah, you may have an abundance. I mean, that may be a forage that deer have so much of it that they're seeking other nutrients from other plants that they might get from a brassica or a cereal grain.
I mean, it's everywhere. It's crazy. It's like when we cut a field, it looks better than my clover plots.
Interesting. Wow. So yeah, maybe you don't need to plant. You have it. It exists.
I've thought that in the past. I don't know.
You know, all of this obviously talking about food plots and nutrition is kind of leading up to what we're seeing now, which is, you know, accelerated antler growth, which is what everybody gets excited about. You know, I think it's interesting, Bronson. We've seen, and I know the variety of factors to it, right? But we've seen certain deer, even in Kansas, where, I mean, we've got some deer that are
way different.
Yeah, I mean, damn near close to full grown, what I would say is full grown.
70, 80%, and some that are at like 20, 30%.
Yeah, I mean, like, just giant, like what seems to be going to be a big buck, but I mean, it's just
in the same
4-inch
picture, like similar age class deer.
4-inch nub.
Yeah, in fact, one is a buck that I missed a couple of years ago in Kansas. He's got to be 6 or 7 at this point.
And he's almost 70 or 80% full grown.
And there's a buck in the background that looks a similar body size. I bet he's maybe a year or two younger.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, he's got
just like this sitting outside of his head.
Yeah.
No branching, no nothing.
Yeah.
It just seems, I feel like.
What causes that?
Well, I mean, one, I would say it's when they're dropping their antlers, right? I mean, one dropped earlier than the other would be my.
What causes that?
Good question.
Thank you.
I wish I had a good answer for this, but because it seems like every year we especially with trail cameras now, we get to see the different accelerated, antler growth with certain bucks. I don't think we have any real rule for cause other than individual variation, just genetics, for example. And I remember a couple years ago, I reviewed a paper. It was not with whitetails, it was with another species. And it was in more of a farmed environment. But it was radically different. This was hundreds of different bucks. And it was radically different on when they started and when they stopped. And these ecologists looked for all these different reasons, whether it was the nutrition and the temperature that year and on and on and on. And there was really nothing that would predict it. And kind of the overall conclusion was it's just the way it is. Bucks are different. Maybe it is something nutritionally that's going on. Maybe it's something stress that's going on to diminish growth, the timing of it. but there was really no rule. We really don't know why some are on this accelerated path and others aren't, but they typically end up at the same place. And
are you aware of of a correlation in the same buck from year to year? Like if one buck typically he's an early grower versus a late?
we typically see that, Jared, but I want to be careful that that's kind of a conventional wisdom, and that what we see with a limited number of bucks, I've never put a pencil to paper and calculated what the extent of the correlation is. But yeah, in general, I would say that's the case.
And I mean, I think what's interesting is you see, like, if we think of among different populations in the same area, like there's a lot of factors, buck to doe ratio, things like that, when those testosterone
that's
levels
why I
drop.
think these pictures we're getting in Kansas are so interesting.
It's within the same
picture,
same group, same
standing
picture.
right next to one another, same food, same rut, same everything.
And I mean, I guess part of that kind of loaded question there, Bronson, is that, like, if you look at that deer who we know from common sense and kind of logic that he's probably 70+% complete, some people might look at that and say, man, that thing is going to be a giant, but he's going to cap out here.
Yeah.
His potential is going to cap out, at which place then it's just all calcification.
Wow. That's just
right?
lack of understanding the variation and growth cycle, I think.
Yeah. They just see a big buck in June and they're like, that thing's going to be a giant.
Yeah. There's certain, again, just to use that word, he's on an accelerated path or growth development. So he's going to end quicker. And the one, like Jared, you said, that may only be 30 or 40%, he's going to compensate. He's going to keep growing. It may be growing at a greater rate, or he just may grow a little bit longer, but they're both going to end up come October being in hard antler.
And that's so crazy. I mean, literally, we're talking substantial differences of what are likely same age class bucks, and potentially just, again, judging from the bases of this other buck that's not far along, like, he's going to be a good buck too. May not be as big as this other one, but and to think that he's going to make up that much ground here in the next 8 weeks.
Yeah. It's impressive.
It's wild. I mean,
well, and I assume if he's not, the one that's further behind, he's going to grow later into the season. So while this buck that we call Pretty Boy may be done, by the end of July, this other buck may grow well into mid-August. I assume that's the case, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, at some point, then that calcification process starts, and then that's it.
Right. And the one that's on that's not as developed, maybe he started the process in a deficiency.
Yeah.
Whether it be disease recovery, post-rut recovery, whatever.
Yep.
But maybe he started out at a place to where, rather than jumping right into spring green up and building up, he had to recover more of what was lost. He might be one of those bucks like that only lost 10 to 15% of his body weight during the rut, versus the other one maybe lost 25% of his body weight. So he had a longer time to remember the growth priorities too. Body number one, antlers number two.
Right.
Build the body up first.
Maybe he's just lazy, just slacking.
Is it, although different hormones, I guess, and factors, would it be fair to say that there's a chance that buck that is more likely to top out in the end of July could also shed his velvet earlier?
I can't say definitively, but I would say yes, that is more likely. I would think that is more likely. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I told you last time, and I don't think you can see it over our shoulder, but I killed a buck. This is the one that Jeremy was mentioning out of that clover plot a couple years ago. He's in full velvet. This is the first week of October. And did I tell you about this buck last time?
I don't think so.
Call him Fuzzy Wuzzy. So the year before I killed him, so he was 4 when I killed him, to the best of my knowledge, and he was 3 the year before. And we noticed as a 3-year-old that he never shed his velvet throughout the entire season. Like I got a picture of him on October 15th, and he's still in velvet. I'm like, what the heck? That's weird. And clear into the late season. And we never saw the deer on the hoof, I don't think. And but I was getting pictures of him in like December, or I'm sorry, like February, March. I should say at least January, February, still in full velvet. And I was like, man, that's crazy. I took my cameras down at some point because I just, whatever, the season was kind of over. I was wrapping up. And I put them back out like in May, probably of the following year. Just because I, just got them out, was excited. And in May, I got a picture of this buck, looks almost full grown, big old rack that he's got on him now. This deer ended up scoring like 157 or something like that. Like, and he was almost like full grown to the best that I could tell. I was like, what the heck? Like, that's so weird. And we watched him throughout the whole summer, and like, he didn't really get a whole lot bigger than that. He just was like, he kind of finished growing. It seemed like in like May or early June. And, my theory on this deer here is I don't think he ever shed his antlers as a 3-year-old. I think he held on to them and maybe broke some stuff off and regrew over top of them as a 4-year-old, and retained his velvet. Like I said, I killed him like October 1st or 2nd in full velvet.
Yeah, but not like breathing full velvet. Like it's hard and dry underneath. It seems like it.
Yeah, he's not. Well, no, it's not like there's. I mean, it's just like like he's about to shed out. It's not like he's actively growing the whole time.
Would. Yeah.
Did you get photos of the buck, say in November, December?
Yep. Oh, as a 3-year-old.
As a 3-year-old, tell me what his body looked like. And what I'm asking
small.
is,
and even now when I killed him, yeah, he's not a big, like, rutted up buck. In fact, I doubt he rutted at all.
Okay.
So I did some investigation, obviously. Like his testicles had something up with them. Like they were very shriveled up, very small. His neck is
That's not nice to talk about him like that.
His neck is much smaller than a normal, buck. He's almost just like a big doe, but certainly like he had the equipment of a male. So
there you go. Give him credit.
Yeah.
So it
shaft size wasn't lacking. I mean, yeah. he was pretty adequate if you ask me.
Yeah.
It sounds like he never had the surge in testosterone, and it may from his testicles be a production issue, but he never had enough. And that was the reason I even asked about the body shape and so forth, was that he didn't have that surge of testosterone to cause antler hardening and velvet shedding. And then what we see, building up the musculature come fall.
Mm-hmm.
So he was still a viable male and had testosterone in his system, but it doesn't sound like he had the peaks and valleys that we would normally see in that annual process.
Yeah.
But man, that's a rare, congratulations. That's a cool deer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Like once in a lifetime, I would assume. I mean, it's pretty rare.
Well, it is. And again, how many guys would have saw that deer in May and been like, oh my God, this thing's going to be a world record. And it's just that lack of reality of like how these deer individually do. And I get that. Like, I mean, if I see a buck that's looking, well, when we saw Pretty Boy in May or something, I'm like, yeah, that deer's going to be a stud. And he is, but it's not like he's going to just continue to grow through the entire, at some point he stops.
Sure.
Right. And that cycle is kind of what's interesting. I mean, so what's most research looking at, Bronson? And I don't know if it varies by age or not, but I mean, what are these deer looking at from a growth cycle in the summer? I mean, what's that range of inches per antler that they're putting on every year?
Or every day.
Every day. I mean, sorry.
Yeah, I think it comes down to it's less than half an inch a day. It's probably more like a quarter inch or a little bit less. I think that's the right number, about a quarter inch a day. So you're definitely looking at over the course of a week or so, you're going to have an inch or more.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole process is kind of interesting that gestation length and the antler growth period are both about 200 days. And so, but, literally after shedding, after hard antler shedding, we have that period of time to where a scab forms, and then we start to see the development of the antler and velvet. And then it's just this incremental, slow process You all know this, of course. Bucks are really unique. It's pretty phenomenal in what they do. The amount of minerals that they have to mobilize, they cannot keep up with the amount of minerals they need dietarily. So they have to mobilize it from their bones and even go through what we call a kind of a short-term osteoporosis. And then they have to backfill, those minerals once they develop hardened antler. And that's why, diet quality is so important.
Can I just question or make a point about like here's the end result that I'm looking at is like a 200-inch buck grows that rack in the same time that a basket rack 8 is growing his, correct? Right. And so I think it's fair to say that a 200-inch whitetail is growing at a much faster rate. Is that correct?
I would say the rate is the same. It's just the volume at which they're doing it is different.
So he's growing a percent of his final score in the same amount as a percent of a final score of a basket. Sure. The volume, how much antler growth he's putting on in that time frame is more.
Well, so it's your comment about like maybe it's a 1/4 inch per day. I don't know that we can say that, right? Because for a 200-inch deer, it may be an inch a day.
Yes.
And for the basket rack 8, it may be 1/8 of an inch a day.
So I would express it like if we were going to measure the main beam, is that in both of those, it might be a 1/4 inch a day. It's just that you have on the 200-inch deer, you have more tines. So you have more pieces of antler that are growing at that same rate.
Okay. So you're not saying in total, this set of antlers is growing a 1/4 inch. It's each individual tine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Which over the course of a 200-inch deer is a lot of inches.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just like one train is going this way in one direction, and the other. How long is it going to? If they both have the same amount of time to travel.
Yes. Carry the one. So I think when you. Yeah, I mean, it is kind of crazy to think about that process and how those deer are going through that.
It's just nuts, period. That like a 200-inch whitetail can do that in 200 days.
Yeah, put it together.
It's like $1 an hour.
He ain't working right now. So Bronson, when you talk about those minerals, I know one thing that like people are really adamant about right now is putting out mineral blocks and stuff. And yeah, I would say in most cases, a lot of those are.
Go ahead and answer that. I'm going to take a leak real quick.
Okay. You want to pause for a pee break?
Let's do a pee break.
Okay.
All right.
Let's do that.
All right. I'll lead the charge here.
Yeah. All right. So getting into, I guess, the minerals, like obviously right now, May, but really the summer is when people are really starting to focus on minerals. And, I know Jared and I put out a lot, and a lot of it's just for camera attractiveness, but whether it's industry perceived or whatever, a lot of people will look at minerals as a necessary thing to be putting out for their deer herd. I guess kind of two-part question. Number one is, what minerals, and whether we're looking at it from a doe and lactating side or a buck and body and antler growth, what are those minerals that those deer are needing to support that body and antler growth? In particular, when you talk about that, temporary osteo issues as they're growing their antlers. So let's just start right there, I guess.
It's primarily that there's others, that there's probably 10 or more minerals and micronutrients that have been identified, but the main ones we're concerned about, calcium and phosphorus. That's mainly, what's needed for bone growth, bone stability, bone health, et cetera, and then also for antlers. So that is typically what you will see in a lot of those minerals. If they don't have that, then in my opinion, that would be a worthless mineral supplement if they don't have calcium and phosphorus.
How are the deer obtaining calcium in their diet without supplemental nutrition, I guess, or was supplement mineral?
Very interesting. You can both do this fall. When you go to one of your food plots or the edge of an agricultural field, etc., notice that you will see some hardwood trees that are on the border of your food plot, on the border of a soybean field or whatever. And it will be a full grown tree that you would perceive, as I do, as this is very unpalatable. It is this old, hard, lignified, at least appearing leaf. And down here, that might be an elm tree. It might be an old water oak, this limb food plot. And this is before, I'm not talking about a deer using it as a licking branch for a scrape. And you will see a very subtle browse line on that. And you think, why on God's green earth, when right here is a food plot of soybean or clover or whatever, why would a deer be consuming this water oak leaf? And it's for the calcium. At least that's what we think. Calcium is one of those minerals that you will see in a higher concentration in older plant tissue than in younger plant tissue. Phosphorus is very much correlated, the same trend you would see with protein, crude protein. You typically will see that phosphorus. The very young tissue that's growing has phosphorus in it, but not so with calcium. So at least, Jeremy, that is what we think. Deer always prove us wrong, but that is what we think is the primary reason why you'll see them browsing this old tree tissue, for example, is getting calcium, which leads me to believe, Jeremy, is calcium limited in your environment?
Yeah.
If it's ubiquitous in all of these tree leaves, do you have to provide it in a supplement?
Is it, so let's take that hypothesis for a second and assume that they are getting their calcium, or they're able to achieve calcium from these more mature established tree limbs and things like that and leaves. Would it be a interesting supplemental management action to go in and topple and open up canopy on some mature trees during the antler growing season now, for instance, to bring those all down to deer level? Because obviously if we're talking more mature trees and stuff like that, it's a 6 feet and under range, right? I mean, that's what we're taught to look at. So with most of those leaves and tree limbs and stems being out of deer reach, would it be worth going in and open up canopy and dropping them down to bring them into deer reach?
I've got kind of a complimentary comment or question. And there's been some guys that have pointed out or I'll just say how I've gotten to it. So a bunch of the trees that I've cut down, whether I've done like a hinge cut or a clean cut of some of these bigger, older trees, that I've seen it with cherries, oaks, kind of like you name it. They stem out a lot at the bottom, like right where I've cut it off. It's like the tree's going to regrow.
Yeah.
And it seems like the deer are they hammer. Like
tulip poplars do that for me.
Yeah. The hunting public did something on that where they were really noticing like some mineral.
This guy also did something on that.
Okay. So is this all tied together, different, the same?
Yeah, it's very much tied together. And to give credit where credit is due, while he was here at Mississippi State, Marcus Lashley certainly led that endeavor. And we called it, just to kind of have a little catchy name so people can kind of remember it, we called it mineral stumps, to kind of play on, we're using a stump to provide minerals rather than putting out minerals. And so, Jared, kind of what's happening there physiologically with the plant is that you have this massive root ball. Let's say you've got a tree, whatever species, it could be elm, sweet gum, tulip poplar, whatever, and it's a 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch, whatever DBH. Well, underneath you have this huge amount of root system. And that is matched, those amount of roots and the biomass of roots was critical to provide the upregulation of all those nutrients to that huge tree above it. Now you've eliminated that. And so you've taken the top off of it. Now it is all those nutrients are surging and growing in a higher concentration in that new tissue as it grows. And so what Marcus literally did a lot of plant quality sampling. And in many of the things, and primarily I remember phosphorus and I remember crude protein, indistinguishable from a soybean. There was that amount in those sprouts coming from a plain old elm tree or a plain old sweet gum or something like that when you stumped it like that. So that I guess, Jared, that is the reason why the mineral concentration is so much. You have so many more roots compared to the above ground biomass. That's why the concentration is so great.
Yeah.
But I don't say, Jeremy, speaking to your point, I don't know, this would depend on time since you cut the tree. I don't know if you would have the accumulation of calcium 2 months, 3 months, 6 months down the road. That might be an older plant to have the greater accumulation of calcium. But like we always say, diversity.
Sure.
Do both. You're going to have the calcium from the existing trees that are out there as long as the tissue is within reach of the deer.
And I guess I look at it as anywhere we're doing timber stand improvement, a lot of our, mainly because I think we're bored, but we do a lot of timber stand improvement in February and March, where trees are bare, it's winter and that kind of thing. I just wonder, just like you would do different from a summer burn versus a winter burn, if you came in and did some timber stand improvement in the antler growing season and you drop those trees with those leaves and that calcium deposits in those areas down into deer level, I'm still getting my timber stand improvement, which is opening canopy in the summertime, and I'm dropping down potentially, a source of calcium for those deer during the growing season. I don't know.
Ben Rising was one that, and he's a forester, so I'm sure he knows more than I do, but he always was in favor of doing TSI during the summer and the growing months, but I never really understood it because, well, first of all, it sucks cutting trees in the summer. It's just hot. But also, like, when I'm hinge cutting and stuff, like, it's not killing those trees. They're still going to grow, and I just prefer to cut and I have more time to do it in January and February. So
I know hinge cuts have got kind of, I won't say a bad name. I felt like for a while there, like, hinge cutting was the thing to do. It was like, hey, let's bring this tree down into deer level. Let's create horizontal cover. Let's keep it connected so that it's still growing and we're opening up the canopy. I guess, Bronson, pure opinion, but like, what's your take on hinge cutting versus clean cutting or girdling?
Both have their place, in my opinion, and it depends on what is limiting on your property. So if you want instantaneous cover, if that's the limiting factor you're trying to manage for, then hinge cutting can be a great tool. I mean, literally in 1 week or sooner, as soon as the deer find it, they can start using that for bedding and for cover. However, if herbaceous plants is the limiting factor, then I want to kill that tree and create a canopy gap so that the rubus and the pokeweed and the ragweed and all that. So they both have their place. And this is a very safe thing to say, but I would stand by it. Both of them are probably needed on every property to some extent. You can probably, even on a well-managed property, think, I've got 100 acres right here, or I've got 50 acres right here. I'm not providing any cover. Why don't I create a gap? Why don't I do some hinge cutting and I can create a bedding spot right here? So both of them are great tools. The danger I see is that everybody tends to go one way completely or another way completely. Hinge cutting is the best. You need to do it, or you don't need to do it. You need to do it some. It's a great tool to do some of the time.
I think so I've done quite a bit of this. I think that a good balance of those two is relatively easy to achieve because you can't hinge cut every tree.
No, it's just going to keep.
You just can't. There's only a certain size of tree that will tolerate it, and there are certainly different species. Like, try to hinge cut a big cherry, like, it's just going to break off every time.
Yeah.
So I think if you set out and try to hinge cut as many of them as you can, depending on like what your forest looks like at the start, you're going to end up with probably half and half.
Yeah, and I think that's great. I mean, I know, like, my property, even here at the house and in Kentucky to a point, because it's mountainous, like, I'm lacking forbs and openings. It's typical big mountain country, but I also am lacking cover to a point because it's closed canopy areas. So trying to intermix those two together to create habitat for bedding, but also, better opportunity for native food is a huge thing that I've continued to work on.
Freaking works too, man. I've seen like such a concentration of, even mature bucks held up in my TSI areas. Like it just, from a cover standpoint, and I have to assume from a food standpoint, like it just makes such a big difference.
Yeah, they like thick cover for sure. So yeah, I guess on that mineral side, that's an interesting point. Because I mean, we know that, listen, it's no secret, most of these mineral blocks are 95+% salt.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there is a need for salt in some cases, right?
Yep. It is a critical nutrient. Deer have to have it. They're attracted to it. But just don't be mistaken that a deer going to utilize the salt and also getting some minerals, that you're having any population level, impact on minerals and on antler growth by doing that. One thing we have to think about, Jeremy, I know your wife anyway. She's the athlete in the family.
Yeah, by far.
Nutrition is very important. I'm sure she's read all about supplementation and things like that. And really, when you get into the weeds, it's real easy to go, I'm going to take this multivitamin, and you can see it listed there. Here's the calcium, here's the magnesium, here's the blah, 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 on and on and on. But then you go another level deeper from nutrition experts, and they'll make comments. Is that nutrient being provided in a way that the human body can even utilize it? So yeah, there is calcium in that pill, but is it delivered in a chemical format that your body recognizes and can use it and assimilate it? And those are things you're not. So you'll typically see then other supplements say, we have providing it in a form that you can use it. That's one of my big issues with minerals and mineral blocks and deer and so forth, is, in my opinion, and again, I'm not a big nutrition expert, but this is a concern, is that deer evolved eating plants and getting the calcium and the phosphorus, et cetera, from the plants. They're an herbivore. They have gotten everything they need for thousands of years through eating plants. So by concentrating it and putting it in some form and in a block, can deer utilize it? I don't know. I can't sit here and say it is doing no good. All I can say is that there has never been a study to demonstrate that you are going to get a population level effect. And what do I mean by population level? I literally mean that you'd have to have a really big study. It'd have to be for a number of years. You have to sample a lot of deer. But do we see, on the average, accounting for age, do we see a 10% growth difference in antler growth because we added minerals to the landscape? No one has ever done that. And that's partly because it's really, really difficult.
Sure.
There are so many other extraneous factors affecting antler growth. So being able to isolate that mineral. Can you do it in a deer pen? Well, yeah, you can, because you're completely controlling their diet, and deer do not have access to all of the natural vegetation where they would naturally get those minerals. So I know it seems that deer biologists are really wishy-washy about this. There's no evidence to support it. And then someone will say, well, in a deer pen, well, those are just very, very different systems, different types of questions, and very complicated to answer.
Bronson, can't they, or haven't deer also gotten, will they get it from the soil directly? Like, there's such a thing as just a natural mineral deposit that, guys will come across, or?
Yeah, you'll see this. I know there's been some accounts, some very rigorous accounts in West Virginia and in Indiana, where you'll have these exposed, soil licks or mineral licks, and a lot of it will be sodium, salt, and other things. And there's no doubt about it. Deer travel a great distance. It might be every day or once a week, and they will utilize that. And it's obvious they are getting some mineral that is not as available in the ecosystem that they're in.
Interesting.
Can I do a shameless product plug?
Yeah.
Just okay, cool. Well, no, I wonder just in terms of the calcium side. So think about Deer Grow and Plot Start being liquid calcium, right? Derived from calcium chloride. It's liquid calcium. Obviously, we're using that from a soil additive, but a lot of that then in the soil potentially can be essentially uptaken by the plant itself, which then, in theory, and pass to the deer to eat. And I'm not just saying Plot Start, lime in general, right?
Yeah.
But anything that's calcium into the soil then can be, brought in by the plant, and then in theory should be passed on to the deer, right?
Sure.
Yeah, we had a great example of that. It wasn't calcium, but it was phosphorus.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a typical phosphorus deprived soil here in the Southeast, and we, chemically added that via fertilizer. And then studied the resulting tissue. So the same species of food plot forage, supplemented with phosphorus, we saw greater growth. We then sampled the tissue itself. There was a greater phosphorus concentration, and that is precisely where we saw the greatest deer use and selection was for the phosphorus enriched plants.
Yeah.
It's again, in general, from a lime, Deer Grow, fertilizer, whatever you want to call it, like, again, is probably re-emphasizing the importance of those, not just from a growth standpoint, but from what ultimately will pass to your deer from a food plot standpoint.
Yeah.
And that's something, too, your listeners can do. We talk a lot about getting a soil test,
Mm-hmm.
Go to your county agent, your county extension office, et cetera. You can typically do the exact same thing with a forage sample as well. You might have to contact them, and it's a little bit special test, might have to go to a different lab at their state university. But if you're ever curious as why are deer hammering this particular plant on the edge of a food plot or in the forest, take a forage sample, send it into your extension service and look at it. And there is probably going to be a high level of protein or phosphorus or calcium or something like that is why the deer are after it.
Very cool.
Yeah, makes sense.
Well, Bronson, we know you got a busy day down there, and we took up half of it for you. But again, we appreciate you coming on, man. I think that this will be a regular thing if you're up for it to have you in and pick your brain for some deer knowledge, just because, we're always curious. I mean, again, any advantages that we can figure out, we surely need to outsmart these things.
Yeah, man. Happy to. Thanks for inviting me. And if Jeremy and Jared, if I could make a plug real quick, some stuff we have coming up.
Please.
And we'll announce it, social media and so forth when it's ready. But we're going to have an online seminar series. That was kind of one of the positive byproducts of COVID and everything, is we took our typical seminar series and we've got it recorded now. So we're going to be releasing that this fall. So rather than coming and hearing me and Steve yammer on for 8 hours, you can do it at your own home and watch that. We have some publications coming up, some kind of long form extension publications. One of them is going to be putting together what we think are the critical issues of interest from our buck movement study. So having all those bucks GPS collared, we hope we have answered all the kind of the management questions related to that. And then we have one on the best management practices for supplemental feeding and things like that. If you're going to do it, here's how you do it. What are the good, bad, and the ugly, the pros and cons. So we're really going to tease all those things apart there. So I guess just look for those 3 products this fall.
Is that when this fall those will be out?
Yes. Yep.
That'd be something. Maybe we can look at the buck movement and the supplemental feed ones for ourselves, and then kind of do a follow-up podcast on those. I think that would be. Those are always burning questions that people think that they might know. Or
when you say long form, like how are those actually getting published and distributed?
Jared, rather than it being a 4-page magazine article, think of a 30 or 40-page publication,
like booklet.
Awesome.
PDF to download. But I mean, we really want to try to in one paper, one manuscript, address all of those issues. So you have kind of a one-stop shop publication for all those questions.
How would folks get their hands on those?
We will we'll announce it on social media and provide a link for download. We'll also have it on our website. And then, of course, through the Mississippi State Extension Service, we'll have a link there for viewing online and also for a PDF download.
Oh, so they're free. And you can download it right there.
They're free to download. Yeah,
that's awesome.
Right
I know
on.
one that you and Dr. Damaris did not too long ago that I've spent a lot of time in and have worked with a lot of private landowners on is the selective harvest strategies piece. And that's one that, you know, maybe it's not for everybody that's listening to this podcast, but anybody who's like, and I know Jared would probably find this interesting, like literally looking at a population dynamic standpoint of their property, and like from a camera survey to planned attacks on removing maybe bucks that you normally wouldn't think about removing, but are call it the lower cohort or the lower quality deer in each age class. It's really eye-opening to see, maybe not from just a pure practical, I'm going to do this, but even from a theory of, okay, if I do this survey, this is how I've used it, at least, Bronson. If I do this camera survey and I look at all the age classes, I group my bucks, I score those bucks, whether with buck score or something else, and then I remove the lower 1/3 from each of these age classes as poor deer. What does that do to my average quality, and what could that potentially free up? And the theories around that, I think, are really, I've enjoyed it, at least. I know a lot of people that I've talked to who are very serious about deer management on a property have found some good insight, whether they actually apply it or just to understand it better.
Yeah. And Jeremy, thank you for recognizing that.
See, that's a good plug, right? And you can tell Doc that I gave him a plug.
Yeah, I'll let him know. Appreciate that.
He'll be like, who?
we took that to the next level in our book that's available on Amazon, and it, you know, it's 120 something pages, so it was very costly for us to try to print it. That's why it's for sale. You got to pay for it to get it. But we really outline that process very, very clearly. How the system works, the biology and the ecology behind it, if it's misused, what you see, and if it's applied correctly. So selective harvest system, if you were to look that up on Amazon, you'll see that there.
We can put a link in the description for that too.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I think that's really interesting and something that I'll kind of have like the...
Let's dive into that. That would be what, later this summer? Would that be an appropriate podcast for us to dive in? Maybe let's do this, Jared. Let's run a trail camera survey on your property this year.
Well, I was going to say I've got like an indirect, consequence of being able to do this because of my crop damage tags. Like I can, that's something I could do here in the summer.
So let's do a camera survey in August on your property. And then we'll get the data all together, and we'll set up another podcast with Bronson and kind of run through the selective harvest strategy mindset around it.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, that sounds great. And that's the perfect time to do it, is when you start getting those images and you start making lists informing all of the people you hunt with. And it comes down to this. These are the bucks we have to protect. These are the bucks that show the greatest promise for being a trophy, or whatever you want to call the bucks you are managing for. And these are the ones that are expendable. These are the ones that we can harvest. And it's just simply categorizing those two levels of bucks. But if you go into it uninformed and just expect random harvests to do that for you, it is very, very, very inefficient. And most people are disappointed with the outcome.
I think it kind of is catered to guys like us who are very particular about hunting specific deer and protecting specific deer. Right. And I think if you apply, I mean, again, the theory and stuff, and I've used this on, Ed Moody. Ed and I have done camera surveys every year, and every year we apply this theory to his property. Now, whether he chooses to harvest every deer we tell him to kill, that's up to him. But at least in theory, we're applying that on his property every year based on the camera survey that Emily and I do.
And he called me this past fall or winter, I can't remember. And he had picture after picture, showing the result of that. And it can be a long process. It may take you 2 or 3 years, but it will work. There's no doubt about it. It works.
There we go. That's the next one. Late August. Put it on your calendar.
Got it.
Sweet.
Cool. Well, hey, we Appreciate it, Bronson, very much. Always good to have you on, and we'll get some links into the description and keep us input with the new releases that are coming out this fall, and we'll make sure that the hunter community gets access to them.
Sounds great. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Good seeing you both.
Always good having you, man. Thank you.
All right. See you soon.
See you, Bronson.
See you, bud. Awesome.
It's cool stuff.
Dude's worth his weight in knowledge.
So basically, like what we were saying there is like by selecting like lower antler quality deer from each age class in a given year and removing them from the herd, you're just going to have a higher quality of...
In theory, you'll have higher quality because two things. Number one is what are perceived to be the best deer in each age class are moving on then to the next age class, right? And at the same time, you're harvesting more bucks than you probably would have normally, thus having more resources, less social stress.
Sure.
So that booklet, and I think, I'll bring it in. I think I have the actual full book that I bought on Amazon. But it's really, I mean, there's a lot of thought process besides, like, it sounds simple. Oh, we're just going to pick these third. But, like, the thought process that goes into why we're picking those thirds and how it was formed systematically. It's not just like, let's randomly pick the lower 1/3. Like, there's a reason for it to where if you harvest too many or too little, it doesn't work. And again, it's one of those things that, like, if you're going to go in on it, you got to go in on it. And, you know, there'll be years that you're killing, you know, crappy 2 and 3 year old bucks. Because you have to, you know, and if you don't and you let them move to the next age class, it's never going to work.
Yeah. It seems like the wrench in that plan might be the neighbors.
Yeah, partially. It is. I mean, Ed's place that we talked about is a little over 500
just
acres.
Natural die off, like just
100%. Yeah. I mean, you're going to have things out of your control, like, oh, I need to protect this deer. He gets shot. That's part of it. Next year, you just evaluate it, and he's not part of the group. Yeah. You know, you can know, or you can, the nice thing about what we've set up in doing it is that we're projecting what they will be in future years. We have those calculations laid out. So if we can say, hey, this deer via, let's say, a buck score is 150 inches at 4 years old, I know what he'll be at 5. If this deer is 110 inches at 2, I know what he'll likely be at 3, 4, and 5 based on trajectory projections. And so you can see if you keep killing those deer out and run the course of a 5-year gamut that, like, all of a sudden it's like, man, those deer are big and consistently big. And it's because you're following this process. And that's assuming, like, things all stay relatively in check.
In theory, it makes perfect sense.
So that'll be a cool one to do. We can do a practical scenario where we take a trail camera survey.
I'd be very curious. I've always wanted to do a camera survey on my place. You know, I've never taken the time to do it, I guess.
And for a lot of people, it's not practical because of state limits. Like, I can't, in Pennsylvania, I have 1 buck tag. So if I need to shoot 15 bucks off the property, I got to go get 14 other people to come in and kill them.
Well, and in my scenario, this crop damage tag kind of makes that possible for me.
Something to look at. But I mean, you think about the minerals, you think about the soybean, that, like, everybody's walked into a bean field and they're like, man, look how the deer are hammering it here and look how they're not touching it here. And it's like, oh, shade, compaction, things like that, like, just, you know, and I'm sure there are bean fields that are getting hammered, but it's not always the choice.
Yeah, no doubt.
So, well, cool. We appreciate everybody listening to HUNTR Podcast, episode 25 with Dr. Bronson Strickland from Mississippi State University Deer Lab. Always good to have him on and dropping some deer knowledge on us, and hopefully you guys learn something from it and can apply it to your own property.
I think we're learning stuff, man. You know, obviously we're starting to come to some conclusions here, and at some point we have to go out and actually do it, you know.
We do.
So that's why I've been thinking for months and months, like, how am I going to do these fall plots and stuff? And so
narrowing in on it now,
there's
man.
a month, I guess, between now and then. But yeah, I think it's going to turn out.
It's coming together.
Pretty good.
Cool. Well, we appreciate everyone listening, and we will see you next time.
Take me